They called it Operation Northwoods. Kept secret for decades, the document was obtained by journalist James Bamford and published in his book on the National Security Agency, Body of Secrets. The author explains, in 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drew up and approved what may be the most corrupt plan ever created by the U.S. government. In the name of anti-communism, they proposed launching a secret and bloody war of terrorism against their own country in order to trick the American public into supporting an ill-conceived war they intended to launch against Cuba. Among the suggestions, a fake hijacking involving remote-controlled planes to be blamed on Cuba, the blowing up of an American ship, also to be blamed on Cuba, and a terror campaign in Florida carried out by anti-Castro exiles, to be blamed on Cuba. The most remarkable fact about Northwoods itself was that it was approved by every single member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the land. Only when it reached the desks of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and President Kennedy was the plan nixed.
The idea was to create a pretext to show that there was an attack by Cuba on the United States, and the idea was to have U.S. personnel from the CIA and other places secretly create terrorism in the United States. The documents actually said people would be shot on American streets, bombs would be blown up. And again, all this, the evidence would be laid to point the finger at Castro.
Northwoods was a proposal for what is termed in intelligence jargon a false flag operation. For students of war, there are multiple overlapping strategies for the defeat of the enemy. The first tactic is well understood: physical violence between opposing armies. The second, far more mysterious, is cyber. In psychological operations, the target is the mind. Not just enemy personnel or infrastructure, but the beliefs, motives, and ultimately behaviors of entire societies. Alexander the Great is credited with one of the earliest recorded examples of the military psyop. When he was forced to retreat from conquered lands, vacuums of power were left in his wake. To discourage pursuers, he advised his craftsmen to build and leave behind massive body armor, such as would befit giants, breastplates and helmets for mythical men 8 feet tall. The discovery of the objects would make his enemies think twice before giving chase. The 11th century warlord Genghis Khan used similar tactics of creative deception. Prior to military campaigns, agents of influence disguised as villagers from an already conquered region would be dispatched into enemy territory to warn the people of the horrors awaiting them. To further intimidate opponents, Khan devised a trick of light. As darkness fell over his encampments, he ordered his men to light 5 campfires, where only one was necessary. Observing the spectacle, one scout reported back that Khan's army had more fires than there are stars in the sky. In the modern age, Psy-war would evolve into an art form. President Eisenhower defined psychological warfare as anything from the singing of a beautiful anthem up to the most extraordinary kind of physical sabotage.
Black propaganda, well, let's start with the white propaganda. White propaganda is propaganda, persuasion, news, media operations of one sort or another that are openly acknowledged by their sponsor, which in this particular case is the US government. So the Voice of America, for example, is white propaganda. Black propaganda, on the other hand, is disavowed by the agency that's sponsoring it. It operates on the basis of plausible deniability, so that if something goes sour or the true goals, the true nature of the propaganda is revealed, then the actual sponsor can say, no, we didn't do that. We didn't have anything to do with that. The accusations that we had something to do with it are just completely wrong. They're a fantasy, and so on. So black propaganda involves both media operations on the one hand, persuasion, publicity, but typically it will be media that poses as opposed to the sponsor in order to discredit the side that's being attacked. Let me give you an example of how that works. Suppose you're in the middle of the Cold War. There's a radio battle, and this is actually a rather benign form, comparatively, of black propaganda. There's a radio battle between East and West, and one side or the other creates a radio station that poses as being the other side's voice, and then says outlandish, stupid, provably false, or very hostile things about the first side. Okay? Well, then the first side can use that as its own propaganda by saying, see, this is the people that we're dealing with. They're completely nuts, or they're completely corrupt, or they have no integrity, or a whole range of other types of accusations.
The false flag operation takes the concept of black propaganda to a murderous extreme. Secret agents carry out an act of terrorism or other outrage, which is then blamed on the enemy of choice. Oftentimes, false flags are perpetrated by what Lawrence Klein of the U.S. Army War College called a pseudo team, individuals who are organized to impersonate enemy forces. Citing examples from the Hugh insurrection in the Philippines, the Mau Mau in Kenya, the French in Indochina, and other conflicts, Klein stresses their utility in intelligence gathering. But there are other, more important uses. In 1951, the democratically elected leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown by the CIA and replaced by the fascist Shah. The man in charge of organizing the coup, Kermit Roosevelt, explicitly referred in his memoirs to the use of false flag operations. In the year 2000, New York Times reporter James Risen obtained a previously secret account of the coup written by CIA agent Donald Wilbur. Risen explains, in early August, the CIA, seeking to stir up anti-communist sentiment in the religious community, stepped up the pressure. Iranian operatives pretending to be communists threatened Muslim leaders with savage punishment if they opposed Mossadegh. In addition, the house of at least one prominent cleric was bombed by CIA agents posing as communists. The fact that Mossadegh was not a communist to begin with was of little concern to the plotters. The real threat was an independent Iran in control of its own oil reserves. Coinciding with the false flags, mobs were paid by the CIA to riot in the streets. In his book, CIA Diary, CIA whistleblower Philip Agee indicates that the tactics used during the coup in Iran became a matter of routine. In some cases, a timely bombing by a station agent, followed by mass demonstrations, and finally, by intervention by military leaders in the name of the restoration of order and national unity is a useful course. During the brutal occupation of Algeria by France, an even more elaborate pseudo-team was created. In the mid-1950s, the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire formed a group known as the Organization of the French Algerian Resistance, or ORAF. Posing as members of the anti-colonial resistance, ORAF committed false flag bombings, targeting civilians with the aim of quashing any hopes of political compromise. Sometimes, false flag operations fail. Under Operation Susanna in 1954, Israeli military intelligence attempted to carry out a series of false flag bombings in Egypt. The targets were to be American and British businesses and were to be blamed on the Muslim Brotherhood. According to Israeli historian Shabtai Tevet, the assignment was to undermine Western confidence in the existing Egyptian regime by generating public insecurity and actions to bring about arrests, demonstrations, and acts of revenge while totally concealing the Israeli factor. The operation was cut short before the bloodshed could begin. Conspirator Philip Nathanson was caught attempting to detonate a bomb in a British-owned theater. Israeli Defense Minister Pinhas Levin resigned over the affair. Some false flags meet with initial success, only to create blowback at a later date. During the attempted coup in Venezuela, anti-Chavez forces intentionally fired on their own supporters, killing several people. The goal was to create the illusion of a popular uprising and government crackdown. The coup plotters, along with Bush administration spokesman Ari Fleischer, appeared on television denouncing the alleged government attacks and offering support for the coup government.
We know that the action encouraged by the Chavez government provoked this crisis. The Chavez government suppressed peaceful demonstrations, fired on unarmed, peaceful protesters, resulting in 10 killed and 100 wounded.
Venezolanos, el presidente de la República ha traicionado la confianza de su pueblo. Está masacrando a personas inocentes con francotiradores. Para este momento van 6 muertos y decenas de heridos en Caracas. Esto no lo podemos permitir. No podemos aceptar un tirano en la República de Venezuela.
It was later revealed that the military officials filmed the segment before the murders took place, exposing their actual sponsorship.
El día 10 en la noche me llaman por teléfono y me dicen la marcha se va hacia el Palacio de Miraflores, va a haber unos muertos y aparecen 20 militares de alto rango pronunciándose en contra del gobierno de Chávez y pidiéndole la renuncia al presidente. En esa prueba ya se habla de muertos cuando todavía no había un solo muerto en la calle y todo sigue como estaba programado.
Gladio, così come è stata definita, individuata, descritta oggi, è una componente di quelle che io ho sempre chiamato strutture parallele. C'è un esercito invisibile, non predisposto per una battaglia, una guerra esterna contro un ipotetico invasore, ma addestrato ad operare all'interno contro quello che in tutti gli ambienti militari è stato sempre definito una quinta colonna dell'Unione Sovietica, il Partito Comunista e le forze di estrema sinistra ad esso collegato.
For 40 years, secret terrorist organizations, many trained by Western intelligence agencies, have manipulated the political control of European sovereign states by a campaign of terror and murder. Originally part of a secret network, these groups changed from being defenders of state security into attackers of the established political order. Until 2 years ago, that secret network was generally known by the single word, Gladio.
Operation Gladio was a secret, highly classified operation that was initiated by Prime Minister Winston Churchill in around the 40s and 50s. At its inception, Churchill intended to set up a secret European-wide cell of military units that would basically be able to mobilize in response to a potential invasion of Western Europe by communist Russia. Now, these cells were actually set up with the support of the United States. NATO was the main vehicle. It was done secretly across many Western European countries. And over time, it evolved into a highly kind of disturbing form of covert action. And Operation Gladio was actually a specific operation as part of this overall process, which was taking place in Italy. What we can say for certain is that within about 10 years, this phenomenon that we saw in Operation Gladio became much more than what Churchill had originally described it was intended to be. And in the end, we had a situation where these actual cells were given the task of actually carrying out various kind of actions, including terrorist activity in different parts of Western Europe, in order to project blame onto left-wing or communist social movements.
The stay-behind networks had been set up to repel a Soviet invasion. Yet the invasion never came. In 1968, a brief for the British Chiefs of Staff noted that the Soviet Union will not deliberately start general war or even limited war in Europe, and that Soviet foreign policy has been cautious and realistic. Nevertheless, the myth of Soviet expansionism remained an important component of Cold War propaganda.
What we are watching is a four-phased operation. Phase one has been completed, the seizure of Nicaragua. Next is El Salvador, to be followed by Honduras and Guatemala. It's clear and explicit.
There is a Caribbean domino theory that's unfolding.
Well, I wouldn't call it necessarily a domino theory. I would call it a priority target list, a hit list, if you will, for the ultimate takeover of Central America.
In addition to justifying imperialism abroad, the myth of the international communist conspiracy would also play out domestically. In Europe, Gladio would provide the ammunition. The stay-behind networks had been supplied with massive amounts of military equipment, including explosive devices, which were stored in secret locations across the continent. In some countries, churches were used. With no Soviet army to repel, the fascists increasingly focused on what they regarded as the enemy within. False flag terror would be their primary weapon. Operation Gladio and related programs in other European nations were kept secret for decades, but eventually revealed in a series of judicial and congressional investigations in the early 1990s. In Italy, the program was closely linked to a Masonic league known as P2, or Propaganda Due. It was made up of military and intelligence officers, political leaders, industrialists, mafioso, bankers, and even Vatican contacts. Among its current members is recent Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. During his tenure as Prime Minister, Berlusconi openly expressed admiration for Mussolini and the philosophy of fascism. During the initial stages of Gladio, P2 was chaired by another avowed fascist, Lucio Gelli. A 1969 memo from a Ginter Press, a fascist front group, is explicit about Gladio's tactics. Acts of terrorism will seem to have emanated from our adversaries, and pressure brought to bear on people in whom power is invested at every level. That will create a feeling of hostility. At the same time, we must rise up as defender of the citizenry against the disintegration brought about by terrorism and subversion. Even more explicit was Gladio participant Vincenzo Vicenguerra, who went on the record for the BBC, stating outright the shocking mission and targets of Gladio. It was called the strategy of tension.
Bisognava attaccare i civili, quello che è il popolo, le donne, i bambini, le persone innocenti e strane ad ogni gioco politico. Per una ragione semplice, perché bisognava obbligare questa gente, l'opinione pubblica italiana, a rivolgersi allo Stato, a rivolgersi al regime per chiedere maggiore sicurezza. Il ruolo della destra d'Italia è stato proprio questo. Si è messa a servizio di apparati di Stato che hanno alimentato una strategia che giustamente è stata definita della tensione, in quanto bisognava portare la gente ad accettare in qualsiasi momento, nell'arco di un trentennio dal 1960 al 1985-86, la possibilità di uno stato d'emergenza. Quindi la gente avrebbe barattato molto volentieri parte della sua libertà con una sicurezza, con la sicurezza di poter camminare sulle strade, viaggiare sui treni, salire sugli aerei, entrare in banca. Questa è la logica politica che sta dietro tutte le stragi, che rimangono impunite proprio perché lo Stato non può condannare se stesso o proclamare se stesso colpevole.
It did seem to be the case that for the most part, civilian governments were not aware of the nature of these operations going on and were completely shocked when they discovered that you had CIA and MI6 through NATO effectively infiltrating their own intelligence services and operating autonomous subsections of these agencies in order to carry out these kind of operations. In most cases we did find, however, that there were specific members of the civilian government who were aware. Either it could have been a defense minister, for example, it might have been the prime minister alone, but it varied from case to case.
One of the first major bombings in Italy occurred on December 12, 1969, at the Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura. 16 people were killed and another 88 wounded when fascists detonated an explosive device. An anarchist named Giuseppe Pinelli was blamed. He took the fall for the bombing, literally, when police threw him out of the window of a local precinct.